My name is Sierra Caldwell, and I've spent 32 years perfecting the art of being invisible. That humid Saturday evening at my sister Mallory's perfectly manicured backyard party, I sat in my usual spot, the shadows by the sliding glass door, nursing lukewarm water while champagne flutes clinked around me like wind chimes in a storm I wasn't invited to weather. The familiar symphony was already beginning, Mallory's theatrical voice rising above the crowd, her perfectly timed pauses, the cascade of laughter that followed her every rehearsed anecdote. Tonight's performance featured me, as it often did, the bumbling little sister who couldn't handle life's simplest challenges. You should have seen Sierra in third grade, Mallory declared to her captive audience, gesturing with her wine glass like a conductor's baton. She spilled orange juice all over Mrs. Henderson and literally collapsed into tears like the world was ending. We're talking full meltdown, hyperventilating, the works. The crowd erupted. My mother's laugh pierced through the rest, sharp and delighted. Dad shook his head with that familiar expression of amused resignation. That's our Sierra, he chuckled, always been dramatic about the little things. I remained perfectly still, a statue carved from years of practice. I'd learned long ago that reaction only fed the beast. Let them have their stories, let them paint their pictures, the truth was mine to keep. But then, cutting through the manufactured merriment like a blade through silk, came a small, confused voice, but she flies the big planes. The transformation was instant and absolute. Conversations died mid-sentence, glasses froze halfway to lips, even the string lights seemed to dim as every head turned toward 10-year-old Liam, who stood by the garden border, his soccer ball forgotten at his feet. Mallory blinked down at her son, her perfect smile flickering like a candle in wind. What did you say, sweetheart? Liam looked genuinely puzzled by the sudden attention. Aunt Sierra, she flies the big planes, the jets. She showed me her uniform and everything. She takes important people all over the world. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of vacuum that precedes earthquakes. I watched 34 years of carefully constructed family mythology crumble in real time, all because a child had no idea he was supposed to keep secrets he'd never been told were secrets. You see, growing up with Mallory was like living in the shadow of a supernova. She didn't just demand attention, she consumed it, processed it, and reflected it back in ways that made everyone forget there had ever been darkness. Blonde where I was brunette, loud where I was quiet, quick-witted where I was thoughtful. If childhood was a stage, Mallory was the star and I was the curtain, necessary for the production, but never meant to be seen. Every family gathering became her personal showcase. If I made honor roll, she'd win the district art competition. If I learned piano, she'd teach herself guitar and perform at the school talent show. The unspoken rule was clear. There was only room for one success story in our family, and that story had already been cast. She's just got that special spark, Dad would say, ruffling Mallory's hair while I sat forgotten at the other end of the dinner table. Some people are born performers. Don't be jealous, Sierra, Mom would add when she caught me watching. You're different. You're more practical. Practical. The word stuck to me like a label I couldn't peel off. By high school, I'd learned to shrink so small that disappointment couldn't find me. While Mallory reigned as homecoming queen, I worked part-time at the school library, quietly saving every dollar for flight lessons no one knew I was taking. I never told them about the acceptance letter from the Aviation Academy, never mentioned the scholarship I'd earned or the dreams I'd been nurturing in secret. When they asked about my plans, I'd mumble something about still figuring it out, and they'd nod dismissively before turning back to Mallory's latest triumph. It was easier that way, safer. When you've spent your whole life being the family disappointment, success feels dangerous, like something that could be taken away if the wrong people notice. The flight academy in Arizona was brutal, beautiful, and absolutely nothing like home. The instructors didn't care about my family dynamics or my sister's shadow. They cared about precision, skill, and the ability to make split-second decisions that could save lives. For the first time in my life, I wasn't practical, I was exceptional. I worked 3 jobs to pay for extra simulator time, baggage handling at dawn, aircraft cleaning at night, and weekend shifts at a diner near the airport. My hands were always stained with grease or coffee, but my logbook grew thick with hours and achievements. When I earned my commercial license at 26, I celebrated alone in my tiny apartment with takeout Chinese and tears of joy no one would ever see. By 30, I was flying Gulfstreams for Apex Charter Services, shepherding titans of industry, A-list celebrities, and foreign dignitaries across continents. I'd navigated storms over the Pacific, landed in crosswinds that would terrify seasoned pilots, and earned the quiet respect of crews who'd been flying longer than I'd been alive. But to my family, I was still just Sierra who worked at the airport. Do you check people in or something? Mallory had asked during last Christmas dinner, not even looking up from her phone. Something like that, I'd replied, because explaining would require them to listen, and listening would require them to care. When I mentioned flying to Nice the following month, Dad brightened momentarily. Oh, is that the new casino in Nevada? I'd simply nodded, close enough. The beautiful irony was that their indifference had become my shield. While they traded gossip and small talk over wine and cheese, I was watching sunrises from 40,000 feet, navigating international airspace, and carrying the lives of strangers who trusted me completely. I'd flown tech mobiles to emergency board meetings, rushed organ transplant teams to life or death surgeries, and brought families together across oceans. And not one person at their dinner table knew. Mallory's invitation had arrived via text at 6:02 a.m. on a Wednesday. Family barbecue Saturday. Bring your famous potato salad. Time to catch up. I hadn't made potato salad in 5 years, and it had never been famous, but I'd agreed anyway. Something in me was ready for this moment, though I couldn't have explained why. The party was quintessentially Mallory, perfectly staged, expertly orchestrated, designed for maximum social media impact. She floated between guests like a politician working a crowd, always performing, always on. When she spotted me, her greeting was characteristically backhanded. Look who decided to grace us with her presence, just in time to help with the corn, too. You always were the reliable one. I'd taken the offered tongs without comment. Let her direct this play however she wanted. I knew something she didn't. The previous Thanksgiving, when Mallory and her husband had gone on their cruise, I'd taken Liam for the weekend. He'd been fascinated by my uniform hanging in the closet, asking endless questions with the pure curiosity only children possess, so I'd taken him to the hangar. I'd let him sit in the pilot's seat of our newest Gulfstream G650, shown him the instrument panel, explained what each switch and gauge controlled. I'd placed my spare headset over his ears and watched his eyes grow wide as I powered up the communications system. You really fly this? He'd whispered. Every week, I'd answered. Are you scared? Sometimes, but that's what makes it exciting. He'd spent the entire afternoon asking questions, real questions, the kind my family had stopped asking years ago. When I'd dropped him off Sunday evening, he'd hugged me tight and said, "That was the coolest thing ever. Aunt Sierra, you're like a superhero." I thought he'd forgotten. Children move on quickly, their attention shifting like weather patterns, but apparently, some impressions leave deeper marks than others. Now, as the backyard party stood frozen in uncomfortable silence, I watched my family struggle to process this revelation. Mallory's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. My parents exchanged confused glances. The neighbors who'd been laughing at their stories about poor, simple Sierra suddenly found their drinks intensely interesting. Sierra, Mom began carefully, I didn't know you flew those kinds of planes. You never asked what kind. I replied gently. Dad attempted a nervous laugh. Well, I guess you've been full of surprises. No, I said, my voice steady and clear. You've just been full of assumptions. The words weren't cruel, but they landed with the weight of 32 years of truth. I watched them settle on my family's shoulders like snow on a landscape they'd never bothered to really look at. Aunt Helen jumped in with forced cheerfulness. Well, that's just wonderful. Flying planes, how exciting, right, everyone? The murmurs of agreement were hollow, performative. They reminded me of the polite applause you hear after a speech no one was really listening to. But Liam wasn't performing. He walked over and stood beside me, his small presence radiating the kind of certainty that only comes from seeing truth firsthand. Why didn't you tell us? Mallory asked, and for the first time in my life, she sounded smaller than me. I considered my answer carefully. There were so many things I could say, about years of being dismissed, about learning that my dreams were too fragile to survive their judgment, about the strange comfort of being underestimated. Instead, I settled on the simplest truth, because you never made space to listen. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had always been there but was only now visible. I stood up, smoothing my simple white shirt, and looked around at the faces that had defined my childhood, my adolescence, my understanding of who I was supposed to be. Are you leaving? Liam asked, his voice small with disappointment. I crouched down to his level. That depends. Do you still want to know what all the buttons in the cockpit do? His face lit up like sunrise. Yes, then maybe I'll come back, I said, ruffling his hair. Just you and me, no audience required. I walked to the gate without fanfare, without dramatics, without any of the emotional fireworks they might have expected. Behind me, I left a silence that felt different from all the others, not empty, but full of possibility, full of questions they'd never thought to ask and stories they'd never bothered to hear. The next morning, I was at 37,000 feet over the Atlantic, hand steady on the controls, voice clear and confident as I guided 200 souls through a perfect dawn. Up there, in the space I'd claimed as mine, there were no dismissive laughs or rewritten histories, just trust, complete, absolute trust from people who knew that their lives depended on my skill, my judgment, my ability to bring them safely home. That's where I belong. Not in folding chairs at carefully staged parties, not in conversations where silence is mistaken for emptiness. I belong in the cockpit, where competence speaks louder than words and where the sky itself bears witness to who I really am. I thought about Mallory, about the way her carefully constructed narrative had cracked when her own son spoke a truth she'd never bothered to learn, about my parents, who'd spent decades writing a story about their daughters without ever asking either of us what we wanted our characters to do. I don't expect apologies, I don't need their validation or their newly awakened interest in my life. What I need, I've always had: runway, altitude, and the unshakable knowledge of exactly who I am. Up here, the sky doesn't ask where I've been or why I stayed quiet for so long. It simply clears the path ahead and lets me fly. And sometimes, that's enough. Sometimes, that's everything.